Good evening, everybody, and welcome to another 67 from home. We are coming to you once again live from the virtual club here in Singapore, where we have finally come out of lockdown. The restrictions were lifted on Friday, so I have been out very dutifully sampling the wine scene of the city, making sure it's all okay. Everything seems to be back up to speed. In fact, there's quite a lot of crowds when you go out to restaurants and pubs around here. In fact, so much so that a few of them have subsequently been shut down because they weren't observing social distancing. So that's very unfortunate for them. But it's good news, generally speaking, for Singapore. And what we really hope to be able to do is start working on the club again very soon. So look out for more news about that. This evening, I'm going to be talking to you about rosé and who makes the world's best rosé. And that is a question that I hope you will help me answer. I've got a bottle of pink here by my side. I'll tell you about that in a moment. I'm hoping very much that you've got something pink that you're drinking also, and I would very much love to hear what you are drinking. So as usual, if you want to get in touch with us, please do so through the chat box. And if you have any specific questions for me to answer, then use the Q&A box. Now, we have got a couple more events coming up just today, which I'm going to tell you about. At 4 o'clock in the UK, there is a Chenin Blanc tasting with Café Van Zyl MW from South Africa. We've got the top premier crew of the Côte de Nuit at 4 o'clock, and then Domaine Thénard at 6 o'clock, who are the second largest owners in Le Montrachet Grand Cru. Could you tell I was reading that just then? Sorry, I don't have all that stuff memorized. Anyway, lots more events today. And as usual, you can find all of the details on the 67 Pall Mall events page. Just go to 67palmal.com/virtual-events, or just navigate to the homepage, you'll see it all there. So I have got some slides to show you, but first of all, I thought I'd sort of talk a bit about rosé and tell you what I'm drinking. So it is a Provence rosé. Maybe that's a clue as to what I think is the best rosé in the world. This one happens to be from Chateau Les Mesclans, and it's Cuvée Saint Honorat, the 2019 vintage, 13.5%. And as you can see, very typically pale. Actually looks a little deeper on screen than it actually is in reality. A very pale, very typically delicate style of rosé that I'm going to be enjoying throughout this session. I see that somebody's got Garrus, or at least is saying that the world's best rosé is Garrus, and that will certainly make an appearance. Probably the best known of the Provence rosés, certainly in the prestige bracket anyway. So Alexis, if you are drinking Garrus, let us know what vintage that is. So rosé as a category has been a great success story, and I've got some stats to share with you. Over recent years, it has become one of the most popular categories, from something that when I started in the wine trade 20 years ago wasn't taken particularly seriously. So it's become a wine that has got a much greater following and is being taken much more seriously. And I think that raises an interesting question, which is a good place to start, which is there anything intrinsic about rosé that means it can't be as good as red or white? Because the assumption was that it wasn't a serious wine, that it wasn't capable of the complexity or the ageability that you can get from great reds and whites. It probably wasn't even really thought of as expressing its terroir, especially. Although I think we'd all agree now that certain rosés have really distinctive reflections of where they're from, depending on what you personally take terroir to mean. But certainly I would like to think that a Provence rosé has got a very distinctive style that is totally connected to where it comes from, the climate and the traditions and the soil types, perhaps to a lesser extent. But those factors of the terroir of the Provence region are what brings the qualities that we like to that wine. So is there any intrinsic reason why rosé couldn't achieve the same quality as red and white? And I think the answer has to be no. There isn't any intrinsic reason, because there's really no difference. You know, you are doing exactly the same thing in the vineyard. You're trying to grow the best quality grapes you can. You're using the same varieties that are used in the world's top reds, and some whites actually, which are used in the blend for rosés at some point. And there's nothing particularly different about the winemaking. You know, most of it is made with a maceration technique that extracts some colour, but not too much. And, you know, in that case, you might argue that it's got better potential for complexity than white wine does, because most white wines wouldn't have any maceration on their skins. So there's nothing intrinsic about rosé that would prevent it from having the same equivalent quality levels to red and white. And yet, when these super expensive premium prestige rosés come out, people are very dubious about them. And that's probably just because, you know, they're new and unproven to a certain extent, but really they deserve to be taken seriously. And here's another example, which is very interesting, which is champagne. Rosé champagne has traditionally always been a little more expensive than its equivalent brut white version. If you think about the Grand Marques and you go and look at the prices of Veuve non-vintage and Veuve rosé, Moet non-vintage and Moet rosé, the rosé is always a little bit more expensive. And that is often, not always, but often for effectively the exact same wine that's just got a bit of colouring in it. There is no more expense required to make a lot of these rosé champagnes. And yet there was a premium on the price for it being that colour. And if that can be true of champagne, then it can be true of still wine, I think. So that's the kind of setup. What we're looking at today is trying to find what the world's best rosé is, and getting there by assuming that rosé can have the same qualities as great red wine or great white wine. So I'm going to start sharing my slides here. So let's talk, we're going to talk about these four main subjects: the rise of rosé, the main rosé regions and the winemaking involved, and then a short list of the world's best rosé, a very unscientific shortlist that I should add is not my own personal selection, but it's one that I have taken from various different sources, looking at what has scored very well, what sells for high prices, what people have been talking about. And then we're going to finish with kind of answering what is the point of pink wine? And that is related to that first question I asked, you know, can rosé achieve the same greatness as any other wine? And if it can, you know, what is the point of it? You know, why do we like rosé? And by answering that question, we can answer the final question, which is who makes the best? And you'll have to wait until the end to see if I'm going to reveal who that might be. But what I will tell you along the way, because I teased this on Twitter, is what the world's most expensive rosé is. And I can tell you that it is probably not what you're expecting. If you're thinking of the kind of famous wines of Provence, then you would be wrong. And it's also a factor more expensive than those great wines, a significant factor. So we'll get on to that. Let me just make sure I've got the chat box in front of me as I move through this. There we go. Oh, I see that Alexis doesn't have Gareth, unfortunately. Do tell us what you're drinking though. I'm going to avail myself of a little of this as I go. So rosé today, in terms of numbers, it represents something like 10% of the global market for wine, which is about 3 billion bottles sold per year. And that is a number that has increased greatly and I believe is still increasing. And there are certain markets which have adopted rosé with open arms. Certainly in the UK, it has become a year-round drink, no longer associated just with spring and summer drinking, but something that has got credibility throughout the year. It is being taken more seriously as a food pairing wine. It's offered more frequently by the glass. You know, if there isn't a rosé on by the glass now at most restaurants, bars and pubs, they're seriously missing out on a requirement. And a lot of that rosé is sold at perhaps a little higher in price than the equivalent red or white, which is interesting. So it does have a slight premium very often, in the same way that champagne does. What has really driven the success of rosé in a kind of quality and aspirational sense is, of course, Provence. Provence is the largest rosé wine region, always has been, always a focus on rosé in that region. Of course, they make white wine, they make red wine as well. But it's there that they have really kick-started this interest in rosé. And I've mentioned 3 wines there which are important in the context of Provence. So we've got Garrus, which I already mentioned earlier. So Garrus is the top cuvée of Chateau d'Esclans. And Chateau d'Esclans is a large rosé producer that also produce Whispering Angel. That's their biggest brand. But they launched a series of very ambitious, top quality rosé that was notable, among other things, for being aged in new French oak and also having a very high price. And that got people's attention, started them thinking, well, why shouldn't rosé be oaked? You can get oaked Chardonnay. Why is it that rosé shouldn't have an affinity with oak? Of course it can. It just, I guess, was never taken seriously enough. And that is, of course, one of the other reasons why rosé started to get much more successful and popular, is that winemakers started taking it seriously. Previously, rosé was a bit of an afterthought. You know, it wasn't taken seriously by the market. I mean, there are a few exceptions. You know, there are some historic wine regions and wine brands that have always been rosé and have always been, you know, popular in a very, very tiny niche. So, for example, you might say that Tavel, the rosé appellation in the Rhone, is a good one. You know, they've been making rosé for dozens and dozens of years. They were given an appellation at the same time as Châteauneuf-du-Pape, I think, so that would have been in the 20s. And from that point, it was stipulated that they could only make rosé, and they've always wanted to make a very quality-driven style of rosé. So they did exist, but I mean, realistically, they were a tiny proportion of the stuff that was being sold. Most of the rosé being sold when I joined the wine trade in 2001 was Rosé d'Anjou, you know, the semi-sweet wine from the Loire Valley, made from a blend of Gamay, Grollo, Cabernet Franc, I don't know, whatever else is kind of around, I think. There was White Zinfandel and White Grenache from California, and that's still out there. So those styles of wine, very commercial, not complex or ambitious or costly, but they were what represented rosé in most people's minds. And there were other things as well. There was Sancerre rosé, always seemed to be quite on trend. There was Provence rosé. But nobody was really focusing on making top quality rosé from a winemaking point of view because they didn't think the market was there. And then you get stuff like Garrus, which shows the potential of rosé at the top end. Whispering Angel is probably the most successful rosé brand. I think they make something like 5 million bottles of that wine a year, and it's massive in the US. It's also quite big for holiday makers in the Provence region on the Côte d'Azur. You know, it's a big, big brand. It's a brand to be seen with. You know, it's got a prestigious connection, you know, even though the volume is massive. The cost is quite high, maybe 20, 25 pounds per bottle, which is quite extraordinary. But, you know, there's no reason why large volume wines can't still be really good. And I can take champagne as an classic example of that. Again, you know, Dom Perignon is one of the best known. Very large volume, high price, but nobody doubts the quality. The quality is excellent, and I think that's been proven, you know, blind and sighted. Anyway, so we've got an increase in volume. We've got this prestigious Provence region starting to make wines that are expensive and quality and getting people excited about potential and ageability as well. And then we have celebrity winemakers. And I've mentioned Miraval there, probably the best known of the celebrity rosés. But here are 4 others. So a little quiz. No prizes for the one on the far left. But who are the celebrity names behind these 4 wines? I'll give you as long as it takes to have a little sip of this wine. I see that Alexis is drinking Le Rouvre Crozes Hermitage from Jeanne Charve. Excellent. That's a red, but mentions that Tempier is a Bandol Rosé. That's excellent. Rodrigo, quite right to say that Brad Pitt and Angelina Jolie are the owners of Miraval, and that it's made by the Perrin family, who are most famous for Chateau de Beaucastel. The wine to its left is the new Kylie Minogue French rosé from an indiscriminate region. And Miriam has spotted the one on the far right, which is from Sarah Jessica Parker, another French rosé. And obviously, you know, these wines are made by companies on the winemaker's behalf, on the celebrity's behalf, I beg your pardon, and have various different styles. And, you know, they're Kylie wine, which is selling for £9 in Tesco, the British supermarket, took a lot of criticism from wine writers recently for being sort of off dry and bland and not very interesting at all. Does that matter to its consumers? Possibly not. I don't know. I mean, it's certainly pretty well branded, I think, and having Kylie on the label is going to appeal to quite a few people. Nobody's got wine number 3 though. This wine here, Hampton Water. It wasn't Graham Norton. Graham Norton has worked with the same people that are making the Sarah Jessica Parker wine. That is correct, yes. But this wine here, Hampton Water, is not, nobody's got that one yet. While I'm leaving that on screen, I will just tell a little celebrity story of my own, which is about the winemaker Alicia Beth Moore, who performs as the pop star Pink, and who I met 12 years ago, I think, or maybe 10 years ago for the first time in London. And she was, or had recently been studying for the WSET, and had got in touch with me, and we met up and went out for some drinks in London. And since then we met a few more times. I went out to see her vineyard, which is in California, close to Los Angeles. And when I went out there the first time, they didn't have a winery. They were just kind of doing things out of their garage. She's had some very young vines that were just starting to crop. And she made, of course, a rosé. When you're the pop star Pink, you kind of have to do that. And it was never released. It was just kind of made as the first vintage of those vines. And I took a bottle home and opened it. And I've got to say, it was one of my absolute favorite rosé experiences. And her wines have since gone on to be extremely serious, incidentally. You know, these are top quality wines, and wines that she absolutely doesn't brand at all in relation to her entertainment career. It's very much a separate venture. She would never put her kind of Pink identity on the label. That's totally not the point. But it looks like nobody knows. John Bon Jovi. Well done, Jennifer. Thank you. What a shot to the heart. And you're to blame. Yes, so John Bon Jovi made that wine diving into Hampton Water. It's got a very fancy glass capsule there, but I've no idea whether the wine is any good. So here's a little graph that I found very interesting about how rosé consumption has changed. This is just in France, but it goes over the years 2005, 2016. So in France, they're drinking more than double the rosé than they do white. that's pretty extraordinary. And looking at that graph, it seems as if there's a possibility they'd be drinking more rosé than red in another 10 years. I doubt that, frankly, but it could well happen. So that's pretty extraordinary that France has gone so heavily for rosé. And, obviously they are close to the largest source of rosé in the world from Provence, but also from the Languedoc, and, they're obviously Loire and other places are making some. So it's interesting that, that has happened in France. It begs the question, which came first? Did the demand for rosé increase and then Provence was able to respond and realize that there was an opportunity to make premium wines? Or was it that the Provence producers just started working harder at selling their wines and then the consumer responded and started drinking more of it? Probably no way to know that for certain, but it's an intriguing thought. This Provence rosé, I'm not going to do a long tasting note because that's boring, but it's a really classic example of the style that has become so popular. One of the things that I think is interesting about Provence rosé is that it actually doesn't have the characteristics that you would associate with what makes red and white wines trendy right now. It's 13.5%, and frequently, can be that as a minimum, if not more. And it's really low in acidity. I think you honestly have to call it low. Provence is a hot region and they use a lot of Grenache. That combination is going to give you fairly low acidity rosé. And I'm sure they probably can acidify. I have no idea whether they do. I wouldn't be able to taste the acidification here if there is any. But, if you tried to sell a low acidity, high alcohol white or red, you're not going to get many people saying that that is the kind of style that is going to go down well in trendy wine world. And yet Provence is pushing a lot of buttons. Of course, the color matters. That very pale salmon color is something that has become arbitrarily popular. There's no reason why that color should be any more popular than any other. And it won't last forever. Something else will come along that will suddenly become the new thing. But for the moment, that color is what people are going for. And it is an attractive shade. It's very it reflects, I think, the elegance and delicacy of the style. Even though, it's not delicate wine, Provence rosé. It's quite full-bodied, actually. It's quite textural. Mine certainly is. It's quite gummy, almost like broad. And then in terms of the flavors, I often get a kind of garrigue, herby thing, along with, red fruit. Let's just keep it at that. Is it complex? To an extent, yeah. More complex than you might think most rosé could be. And that herby character certainly helps. But this wine isn't oaked, as far as I can tell. It's not especially expensive either, but it's a really solid example. I used a different one of theirs the other day in a session, which was nowhere near as good. So I'm glad I'm enjoying this. Maybe it is a slightly more expensive version of theirs. Anyway. So, prices. This, I think, will interest a lot of you. I've chosen 3 reasonably well-known rosés there. The top one is Clos du Temple, which is made by Gérard Bertrand and was released, I think, last year with the 2018 vintage. It's from the Languedoc-Cabrières region. It is biodynamic, and it was launched at that price of £165 per bottle from the first vintage. And it got a lot of headlines, and, it's like a lot of Gérard Bertrand's wines. I haven't tasted it, I must say. It is an ambitious style. I think it's well marketed. I don't particularly like the look of the bottle myself, but it's clearly been carefully thought out. And for a premium rosé, selling to the kinds of people who are going to want to show this style of wine off, think, they're going to be on their speedboats in the Mediterranean on hot days and have lots of this stuff flying around. It's a cliche, but it's also true. I think the look of the bottle is absolutely vital for rosé, much more so than for red or for white. And again, there's a comparison to be made with champagne here. premium champagne must look the part, and many of them have got these elaborate gift boxes and also bespoke bottle shapes that they use. And that will come into play when we think about what is the point of pink. But there it is, Clos de Temple is £165 a bottle. It's a lot of money for a rosé. Gareth looks like much better value at £95 for what has been lauded as the very best Provence rosé that money can buy. Certainly, you know, that is a fraction of the price that you would pay for the best white wine that money can buy from Montrachet or wherever. And I mean, forget about it, for red wines, they are many, many, many more times as expensive. So is £100 for a premium rosé expensive? Well, you know, I would not pay that price because I know that you can get really great Provence rosé that is almost as good for a fraction of the price. It might not be oaked, it might not be ageable, but again, this comes down to what the purpose of rosé is. You know, I'd be very content spending more like 20 or 25 pounds in Singapore, perhaps up to $50 in that case. And you know, you can get really good rosé at that price. That's totally satisfying and complex and interesting. And then I've also put in Tondonia there. So Tondonia, the famous, very traditional Rioja that comes in red, white and rosé. And the rosé is really not very well known, or comparatively less known. And the most interesting, or one of the most interesting things about Tondonia rosé is that it is oxidative and aged on release. It is a Gran Reserva Rioja. And I think the current vintage is actually 2010, 2009. So it's only released when it's really super mature and way older than you would expect most rosé to be. And that's been one of those wines that has been around for a long time and represents that there has always been ambitious, prestigious rosé out there. But in this case, you know, at £50 a bottle, still seems like a lot of money to most people who drink rosé. But is it good value compared to the white Tondonia or the red Tondonia or other Rioja? You know, it's a really interesting thought. And it's also a completely different style. It's highly unlikely that people that love and drink and buy those Gareth and Clos de Temple would necessarily like Tondonia. It represents the opposite end of the scale. It's a very esoteric flavor. It doesn't have the kind of signature freshness and crispness of young rosé. I shouldn't have used the word crispness there. So just say freshness, because like I said, not high in acidity in this case, the Provence rosé. Anyway, there are three examples of premium prices. And the point I wanted to make was that this is why rosé has become popular, because these wines have legitimized ambitious rosé winemaking. People buy them. And those high prices allow people lower down to charge a little more, to invest a little more, to get a little bit more ambitious. Miriam is telling me that the current vintage of Tondonia is 2008. Thank you very much, Miriam. So 2008, quite extraordinary to think that a 12-year-old rosé would be a thing at all. And, you know, Tondonia is in a very distinctive style where that oxidation and age is part of how it tastes. Anyway, the point I was trying to make is that these prices are all part of why rosé has become such a big deal. But these are not the most expensive rosés in the world, ladies and gentlemen. Far from it. What are the most expensive bottles of still rosé wine that you can buy right now? And this is not a trick. These are legitimately on sale. And they're on sale at Hedonism. And they are all made by the Californian producer Sine Qua Non. And here are some prices of those rosé wines. Now, Sine Qua Non, for those of you who may not be aware, I think it's still correct to say that they only make one wine a year, and that wine is different every year. So they have a winery facility of their own, I would imagine, but they are buying grapes from lots of different places, and they make these very sought after, highly cult wines that people will spend a lot of money on, as you can see. So here are five of the rosés that you can buy today in London. £511 for the 2013, 734, 863, 901, almost £1,000, £1,000 for a rosé from 2009. is that still going to be any good? I don't know, it's a big risk. But then, you know, people risk much more money on old white Burgundy or on fake red Burgundy. So why we shouldn't be any more dismissive of these wines than any others. So, you know, that's quite extraordinary that you can buy rosé wine at those sorts of prices. And looking at the quantities available there, looks like people have been buying them, doesn't it? I mean, people collect sine qua non. You know, they would have it like you would collect vinyl or old books or the handbags. They want to have a complete set. They won't necessarily ever drink it. They might be buying it just to sell on, or just because they want to have these wines in their cellar. Anyway, I suppose the point I'm making is that, you know, it doesn't just stop at a £150 bottle of Languedoc biodynamic rosé from Gérard Bertrand. And it doesn't stop here either, because those aren't the most expensive. No, hold on to your hats, because these are the most expensive rosés in the world. They are still made from sine qua non, and as you can see, they go up from £1,876 for a half bottle, mind you, and then 2,000 something, £2,500, £3,000 am I bid, £6,000, no, let's call it £15,600 for a bottle of 1997 sine qua non crossed rosé. I mean, it looks like two people at least have spent that money and bought this wine at £15,600. And I'm always a little cautious about criticizing the people who spend that kind of money, because to a certain extent, they are funding the industry that, you know, I work in and that facilitates having other wines available and all that kind of thing. Is that wine worth the money? I would love to know. Of course, I don't think it could ever be, but that is relative to what I think is value in wine. For people that spend many, many, many more millions of pounds on fine art, perhaps this could look like actually a really interesting way to, and not bad value, way to experience another sort of human creation. I don't know, but it exists and people are maybe spending that money on it. Okay, so that explains maybe how rosé has got to where it is today. Now let's look at the main rosé regions and the winemaking techniques, because that will kind of tell us what is most popular these days. We've talked a lot about Provence already. It is the largest and most premium rosé wine region in the world, and the most important, I think, at kind of driving this quality initiative. And it is really delicious. I've mentioned three regions there that are particularly well known for rosé: Tavel, Bellet, and Bandol, all of which are historic and have got estates that have become famous for their rosé over many years and have built up great followings, perhaps not dissimilar to the following for sine qua non, you know, people that will collect these wines, that will buy them every year, and perhaps to a certain extent will trade them on the secondary market, but never at prices like £15,600 a bottle. Like we might be talking at, you know, up to 100 maybe, but really very rarely more than that as far as I've seen. Tavel is particularly noteworthy because it is a rosé only appellation. And what's interesting, especially about Tavel, is that it has a stipulation on the colour that it must be. They cannot make pale rosé in Tavel. They have to make rosé of a certain depth of colour. I'm not sure exactly how it is defined, but they must be looking at those other producers in the Côte de Provence who are making loads of this pale, lovely stuff here, and be very envious at the fact that this is all so popular and that dark rosé has become so relatively unpopular. And, you know, I suppose they could declassify their Tavel and call it Côte de Provence, but then they're entering a market where, you know, there's much, much more competition. They have to have big marketing budgets. For a lot of these smaller producers, that's just not realistic. So there's a lot of Tavel out there, which is really delicious wine of its own accord, but isn't necessarily, going to sell for lots of money. Outside of Provence, Champagne. I mean, do we count Champagne? Strictly speaking, for this webinar, I would say no, because we're looking really at still rosés. But if you were to expand it and say, what are the best rosé wines in the world covering all styles, then obviously people are going to talk about rosé champagnes. I mean, there are famous examples, Dom Perignon rosé, Krug rosé, and I'm sure there are tons of grower champagnes who are producing rosés. It's not an area I know a lot about, but I think you would need to acknowledge that Champagne has got the capacity to make premium quality rosé that happens to be sparkling. Okay, now there's, again, like, is there any reason why sparkling wine and still wine shouldn't have the same quality potential? Absolutely not. They've just got different applications, different preferences, different styles, but they're both equally valid in terms of absolute comparable quality, I would say. But then what about those two other great French wine regions, Bordeaux and Burgundy? I mentioned Marsanne specifically because there's a Marsanne rosé appellation, which makes it, I think, unique among the Burgundy village. There's certainly no Volnay rosé or Gevrey rosé. Most of the rest of it is Bourgogne rosé. But Marsanne, you can make rosé. And in Bordeaux, of course, you can make Bordeaux rosé, again, the generic appellation. There's no such thing as Pauillac rosé. And then there's the unusual appellation of claret, which is where we think the term claret comes from. And claret is a pale red stroke dark rosé, depending on how you want to define it. And that in itself is interesting. How many Pinot Noirs have you seen that could easily pass for rosé? There are loads that look pale enough to be called rosé, and yet they're marketed and sold and consumed, most importantly, as red wines. So not fridge cold, served very much as kind of gourmet style food wines. If you look at a lot of the Alsace Pinot Noir, especially, it can be so pale that it could easily pass for rosé. But I'm going off slightly on a tangent there. Bordeaux makes some rosé that is all right, but none of the producers down there have tried to release, as far as I'm aware, a rosé that competes with those prestigious rosés from Provence. And you kind of wonder why. I mean, they certainly have tried to make white wine that competes with Burgundy, albeit in a very different style. But, they're making these new oak, Semillon Sauvignon blends that have great ageability. And of course, the sweet wines, let's not forget those. Why wouldn't they make premium rosé? I suppose the practical answer is that they don't want to make any less red. They're making plenty of red that's selling at decent prices, not all of them, all of the time. But if we're talking about the best known brands, what's their incentive to make rosé? I don't know. Maybe there isn't one, but it would be fascinating to see them try. And you have seen some. The best known of them is probably Clarendelle, who make this rosé that, it's not expensive at the moment, but is very much Bordeaux positioning itself as a region that can produce interesting rosé. Don't forget, incidentally, if you've got any questions, please do stick them in the Q&A now. I'll try and get to them before the hour is up. So do put your questions in there if you have any. So Bordeaux doesn't really compete in the rosé region at the moment, but Burgundy has some, and even the best Marsanais aren't taken as seriously as the top rosés from elsewhere. This is just France. Where else is there? Spain, Rioja is making some interesting rosé. We already mentioned Tondonia, but there are other producers who are doing pretty credible rosé, and a lot of them moving into that kind of Provence space of the prestige cuvée style rosé. I mean, there's great rosé coming out of lots of different countries across Europe. And then if you look to the New World, there are some really hearty rosés that I can think of in Australia. There is rosé being made all over the place. But my point here is that the main regions, the regions that are really closely associated with rosé, it's really just Provence. Champagne, maybe as a distant runner-up. Bordeaux and Burgundy, no. Provence still has the monopoly on serious rosé, and that's quite interesting, I think, especially when you look at how much more rosé is being consumed these days. In terms of the grapes, I mean, you can turn any red grape into a rosé, of course. You can't turn any white grape into a rosé unless you add colouring, which some people reputedly do, whether it's legal or not. But Grenache tends to be the main ingredient. It's certainly in Provence. Grenache is a really important rosé ingredient. And they are very often blends, and they'll use the other southern French varieties, Cinsault, Mourvèdre, Syrah, and there are other options. White wines often blended in, or white grapes, I should say, often blended into the mix as well. So there are quite a few options for what varieties you might want to use if you were making rosé. Of course, in the US, I mentioned Grenache as a white Grenache, and that's very much a sweeter, lower alcohol style. So 9–10% alcohol and maybe 30 to 40 grams per litre residual sugar. A very different market, very much more commercial. Although, is it fair to say that is it more commercial? It's just different commercial, isn't it? Let's be fair. They have a different consumer segment that they're aiming at, and certainly a different price. But in terms of the kind of marketing and the promotion and the targeting, they're both commercial wines. Provence and white Grenache. But what I was actually meaning to say was that the other big grape in California is Zinfandel, as we mentioned. So you can get white Zinfandel. You can get rosé wines made from any variety, but Grenache is really the most important, I would say. And then in terms of techniques, there are basically three. We've got maceration and pressing. So this is considered to be the best quality method. And it's basically the red wine method. You take a load of grapes, you crush them, and you allow the colour to come from the skins into the juice. Usually what happens with rosé is that this is done in a press, so you don't put it into a fermentation vessel like you would with a red. You keep the grapes and the skins in a press, you leave them there for however many hours, depending on how deep the colour is and so on. And the colour leaches into the juice, and then you press the wine so that you are removing the solid from the liquid. You keep the liquid, obviously, which is now a pink colour, and you ferment that as a white wine. So you go and put that into tank or into oak or whatever, and you ferment that, and then you throw away the skins. So that's the basic technique. The Saignée method, named for the French word for blood or bleeding, is when you draw off some rosé wine from a red wine fermentation. So you're fermenting a red wine as normal, and you want to concentrate the red wine, and perhaps you also want to have some rosé on the side. So perhaps a few days into fermentation, you would draw off some of that wine. You're increasing the proportion of skins to juice, right? So that allows you more extraction in the remaining red, and it gives you a little chunk of rosé to play with. Why is that not as good quality? The main reason, I think, is that the grapes have not been grown for rosé. They've been grown to make red wine. They've been purposefully harvested in order to create a certain style of red wine, and the rosé is an afterthought. And so it's not so easy to get grapes that will make excellent red and excellent rosé, generally speaking. You would want to have your grapes grown for the purpose of rosé from the beginning. And then, as I mentioned, there is blending. Now, for a long while, that was illegal. You couldn't just add red wine to white wine and then sell it as rosé. And the reason for that was, incidentally, that there was an excess of white wine and red wine in the EU, and they couldn't sell it. And what they didn't want to happen was that everybody just blended it together and suddenly there's a load of poor quality rosé that's sloshing around. However, I believe now in the Vin de Table category, Vin de France, Vino d'Espagne, etc., you can now do that, I believe. And of course, it's always been legal in Champagne, where you can add a dash of red wine to a brut Champagne and turn it rosé. You do that earlier in the production process, of course, so you get this regular colour and so on. But that has always been legal. And that's why I mentioned at the beginning that sometimes the rosé and the brut are effectively the same wine, but the pink wine has got don't know, 5% of a red wine added to it. Doesn't really make a difference to the flavour, perhaps marginally. It's really the colour that is changing and the price, because they can charge more for it. We used to sell a Pinot Grigio Rosé when I worked at Majestic Wine, from the Veneto or possibly from Puglia in Italy. And it was a pretty deep colour for a Pinot Grigio Rosé. I mean, Pinot Grigio can go that kind of coppery pink on the skins if you let it blend enough. But what they apparently used was Merlot. They just chuck a bit of Merlot in the Pinot Grigio to make it pink and then sell it. Not legal, of course, but when did that stop anyone? And there was another rosé wine that was notorious, Lindauer Rosé, the sparkling wine from New Zealand, which was coloured with, guess the grape variety? Anybody know what Lindauer Rosé used to be coloured with from New Zealand? I'm going to give you the sip of this wine to answer that. Not an easy one to guess. The answer is Pinotage. Apparently they had Pinotage in New Zealand, and what else would they use it for other than colouring a bit of rosé sparkling wine? Anyway, Rodrigo mentions another technique here, which I was not aware of, Schillerwein, co-fermenting red and white grapes in Germany and Switzerland. So there you go. And of course, co-fermentation of red and white is known in regions such as Côte-Rôtie when they're making a red wine. So yeah, why not? Here are pictures from Chateau d'Esclans. This is rosé. I'm not sure which cuvée, but it's certainly one of their premium ones. This is rosé wine fermenting in barrique. And what you can see in there, that contraption that is sticking into the barrel here, that's temperature control. So they've got cool water running in, and what they've got in here is a spear that goes down into the barrel and cools the wine. And this is a temperature probe. So they make sure that they can cool ferment in barrel. And so that is barrel fermented rosé that's aged in new oak and is one of the Chateau d'Esclans wines. Here are the other variables you're considering when you're thinking about making rosé. Should it be dry or sweet? We've touched on that already. Of course, the trend for premium rosé is dry, but there are many examples of sweet rosé which are very popular, albeit in a slightly more mass market kind of simpler fashion. Then maturation, oak or steel. I mean, obviously most people are using steel because the taste of oak and rosé is still unusual, but as we've seen with Tondonia and Garrus, you can certainly have oak influence on rosé and it be balanced. And then maturity, you know, how old the wine is. That brings us back to Tondonia. You know, should rosé be drunk young or can it age? Well, it certainly can age. I've had older vintages of top rosés and they age really well. Why shouldn't they age really well? Again, no intrinsic reason why that shouldn't be. But of course, the association is usually with young rosé. You want to drink it young, fresh, while you've got that refreshing style. So I think older rosé is always going to remain a much smaller niche, but then, I don't know, perhaps not. Here are a selection of rosés that, as I said, you might want to put on a short list of the world's best. So Clos Sibon is from the Côte de Provence, but is made from a grape variety called Tiburon, a very unknown grape variety, and kind of represents a more niche style from within Provence, and that has a kind of strong following. There's Gerard Bertrand's Clos de Temple. Maybe that's only on there because it is, you know, at release anyway, it is the most expensive Provence, sorry, I beg your pardon, not Provence, French rosé that I can think of. Chateau d'Esclans Garrus, yes, we've mentioned that. New oak aged, we just saw those barrels. Serious, age-worthy, and gets lots of high scores, you know, has had significant financial investment in order to make that quality. Here are some more. The Tondonia that we mentioned, a Gran Reserva Rioja Rosado, as they would call it over there, rosé, which is released at full maturity and is praised and prized for having those sherry-like mature characteristics that have an oxidative tone to them. Zillinger's wine, this was new to me, but I saw a few people talking about it. from the Weinviertel, so apologies for that terrible pronunciation, in Austria, around the city of Vienna. And this is kind of a natural rosé. I believe it's fermented and aged in amphora, and I think it has minimal, if not zero, added sulfur, and represents a much more sort of natural style of rosé winemaking. I think it's made from Saint Laurent. Correct me if I'm wrong, if anybody knows. And then another rosé that's from Etna, Feudo Cavaliere, another wine that I'm not familiar with, but I think is made from Nerello Mascalese. It sort of represents, you know, Etna's a super trendy region, capable of all sorts of different styles, quite a large terroir, and people are still exploring it for its quality potential. And here's a rosé that has, I think it's got some kind of cult following for some reason, and I'm not entirely sure why, but that name Millimetri has definitely cropped up quite a few times in my research. Not a wine that I've had the pleasure of trying. And then a Douro rosé, why not? I mean, you can get rosé port after all, although the ones I've tried aren't going to win any prizes. But Newport, you know, they make Riesling, don't they, in the Douro as well? Certainly in Portugal they do. And they're well known for being a kind of creative and sort of slightly anarchistic style of winemaker. And Redoma is a rosé that is taken very seriously. I think I have tried Redoma once or twice. I remember it as being a deeper style of rosé, a deeper sort of colour. And, you know, the Douro is not somewhere that you would think of as going for rosé, but these are some of the wines that I think people would perhaps put on the list. And so we come to our final question. Who makes the best rosé? And what is the point of pink? Is perhaps the kind of lead question into that. So what is the point of pink? I think this is crucial to understand because more than any other style, rosé wine is associated with time and place. That is my key argument. I think that we have more emotional attachments to rosé than we necessarily do for red and white. For red and white, there's an awful lot of analytical tasting that goes on. You know, you look at the en primeur tasting for Bordeaux that's going on now. Lots of scores flying around, people talking about prices. Quality is really important, but these wines have their own brand and, you know, people buy them regardless. So they're very well known and, you know, you don't have to go to Bordeaux to understand them. But with rosé, it's much more about discovering these wines in a social situation, I would argue. They don't have the kind of fine wine association that a lot of reds and whites do, and that allows them to be more casual. So they're often discovered on holiday, you know, that they are, as Alexis says, kind of refreshing, easy to drink. You know, that is their prime appeal. And maybe actually making all these prestigious styles of rosé kind of goes counter to what it should be about. It's certainly possible to make really premium rosé, as I think I've hopefully demonstrated, and there's no reason why you couldn't. But is the point of pink that you want to have a refreshing, easy drinking wine that's associated with your holidays or just casual drinks with friends? I think that's the real value of rosé. I think that's what the Provençal producers have figured out, that this is a lifestyle drink. It's associated with time and place and pleasure and easygoing conviviality. It's not one to be sat down and poured over and analysed and so on. And yet it is possible to do that with superfine top-end rosé. So it's a really intriguing question. What is the point of pink? If you agree that you associate rosé more with the moment than with its intrinsic qualities, as you might do for red Bordeaux, for example, then the best rosé in the world, I'm afraid to say, is an entirely personal choice, because the ones I'm going to choose have got nothing to do with your experiences. So I mentioned the rosé that I had from Two Wolves Winery in California. That's the one that Alicia Beth Moore runs. And that was an extraordinary experience and a wine that I absolutely adored. I've had a really fantastic English Pinot Noir rosé from Vagabond, and they have a winery in Battersea Power Station, just next to it, and I had it there with a winemaker. I think it's the best English rosé I've ever tried. It was stupendously good, but it was really closely associated with the fact that I know the winemaker. He's a good bloke. In fact, we had him on. You can still see that webinar with the Vagabond wines. And that's another association that I've got. If I'd have tried that wine in an en primeur tasting among hundreds of other samples, like they do in Bordeaux, would I have picked it as the wine of the day? I don't have no idea. It's certainly much, much, much less likely. So my point is, the best rosé in the world is the one that you have got that emotional engagement with. Now, I've seen a few more comments coming in, so I just want to address those, and then I've got at least one question to go for. Rodrigo points out that the Portuguese made Mateus rosé, and he bought that in the 80s in Bangkok. Well, not so far from where I am right now. Yeah, Mateus rosé was the epitome of that kind of wine that people would have on holidays for good times. Lightly sparkling, sweet, easygoing, not expensive. For a lot of people, Mateus rosé was, a wine that they had a really positive association with. Alexis says, refreshing style, easy to drink. That's the key to good rosé. And Paul Breakfield mentions Domaine Tempier, who also have a top cuvée. So yes, Domaine Tempier would definitely be shortlisted among the world's best rosé producers. They're a very well-known brand in France. So yes, I think all of those points are valid. And if you've got any particular rosés that you have that association with, let me know in the next couple of minutes. I'd be really interested to see if you've got kind of strong associations with a rosé that you think is the world's best in your world. I'm just going to address this question from Alexis. He says, could Nebbiolo be a good style for future rosé? An alternative style with some tannins. Well, that's intriguing, isn't it? I'd never thought about it. I'm going to have a little sip to think about it. Would you want rosé with tannin? What they say about tannin, and the reason why you shouldn't drink red wine too cold, is that cold tannins have a very unpleasant astringent effect. And a wine like Nebbiolo, which has got really, or can very often have, really aggressive, chalky, hard tannins in their red wines, the famous red wines of Barolo and Barbaresco, etc., then you wouldn't want that cool. And then I suppose the question is, should you drink rosé cool? Maybe you shouldn't. But then what point does it become a red wine? Because Nebbiolo can be very pale. I think a tannic rosé would be a stretch, depending on what you want it for. If you're looking for ageable kind of prestige rosé, then yes, it's a possibility. You have to let the wine age in order for those tannins to subside. I think realistically, for what people value rosé for, tannin's never really going to be a big part of the equation. Also, I'm not sure how you'd achieve it. If you wanted to keep the pale colour, but you wanted to extract tannin, I'm sure there would be ways of doing that. But it's beyond my knowledge of winemaking, I'm afraid. So I hope I haven't disappointed you by not telling you what the world's best rosé is. You can take your pick. If you think it's that £15,600 bottle of Sine Qua Non, then you can go and buy one. You can buy 4, in fact, from Hedonism in London. If you think it's the wine that is kind of most personally associated with you, then I can't tell you what it would be. Right now, this is going down pretty well. And there are lots of Provence rosés that I really like, but I'll always have an emotional attachment to the Two Wolves rosé that I tried, and then this Vagabond English rosé, and there will be others as well that I really, really like. But, trying to compute which the best rosé wine in the world is, in the same way that you could say that DRC is the best Pinot Noir in the world. Few people would disagree with that. You might want to put others up there, but really DRC stands alone as one of the most extraordinary, great Pinot Noirs of the world. You can't do that with rosé, I would argue. Not at the moment, anyway. And who knows what the future will hold if rosé production continues and prestige prices continue to be supported, then maybe we will see something in the future which is more like the undisputed best wine in the world, like you could say DRC is for Pinot Noir or Yquem is for Sauternes. But for that, we will have to come back, I guess, in another 10 years. For now, we've reached the end of the hour and I'm going to have to end the webinar right there. So thanks for joining us. I very much enjoyed hearing your comments. I hope you've got some rosé to enjoy wherever you are. And I will like to see you again for these webinars. The next one I'm doing is tomorrow at the same time, 7 p.m. Singapore, midday in the UK, when I'm going to be talking to Marcelo Papa, who is the winemaker for Marques de Casa Concha and some other brands under the Concha y Toro stable. Really great wines, really kind of branded, very commercially minded wines, but excellent winemaking, really expresses terroir. He's a really interesting, thoughtful winemaker. And they're really affordable too. So please do tune in for that. Same time tomorrow, Monday, 7 p.m. in Singapore, midday UK. And until then, I will have to say good evening and thank you very much for joining us. Cheers. Bye-bye now.